Welcome to the last, but perhaps in a way most important session of this conference, which is to kind of wrap up and think about what came out of the interactions we've had over the past very intense 48 or so hours, but also to help think about the future of the fields of energy and environmental research in the human sciences. Sometimes as humanists and social scientists, we are asked to be predictive of the future, and sometimes those pressures come from outside of our fields and also have to do with us justifying our fields and our continuation of doing work in the university. And in my many years of being in the university context, I don't think I've come across any scholar who's more able to navigate with immense dexterity the inside and outside of the university, talking to different constituents and pulling together different kinds of people than our own Dominic Boyer. He has an amazing ability to talk to different kinds of people and maintain a kind of intellectual focus and rigor, bringing in and helping to create programs. So I think we all owe him a great debt of gratitude for his work with the center and especially for putting together this conference. Now I'd like to ask each of our panelists to go in order, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves very briefly, and feel free to give some remarks about the conference, or if you just want to introduce yourself and then open up for discussion. This will be an informal session where we'll try and think about some of the issues. So we'll start with you, Elizabeth, since you're next.
Okay. Now I've pressed my little button. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. I wanted to first introduce, my name's Elizabeth Long. I am chair of the sociology department at Rice. I'm a steering committee member and someone who enthusiastically supported the institute, or the center, actually, through the birth canal of the Rice bureaucratic process. And I'm very, very grateful to Dominic and Simone for their research and for their program building, and for the opportunity to be at this conference. I am a cultural sociologist by training. I have only recently come to study environmental things. My thing's environmental. My research is on the debate around and movement against fracking in upstate New York, which is where I grew up. And I cannot tell you how enormously helpful the last few days have been in sort of orienting me and giving me new avenues to think down and resources to think with about that work. So actually my first response, and it was almost visceral when I came here and started hearing the panels yesterday morning, which is when I could first get here, was just one of total delight. You know, I kept thinking, what riches, this is amazing, this is interdisciplinarity at its best. This is really exciting, and that sense of delight has sort of stayed with me for the entire time, rescuing me from mid-afternoon caffeine, like low spots and stuff like that. So yeah, just amazing, and I want to thank everybody who's been part of this for providing that sort of richness of discussion. I also would say that listening to people talk about global warming is actually pretty much of a downer. So, you know, delight mixes with despair at pretty much every one of these junctures. We've all talked about that. It's potentially paralyzing. it makes you want to turn off the television, but it's harder to turn off a conference than it is to turn off the television, so you kind of have to keep listening. And that, I would say that although that too was a sort of baseline throughout the conversation, that moving through the conversation gave me a great deal of hope. So I'd like to finish on that. Hope partly because of the unity and power of the papers and the discussion, the sort of integral relationships that the discussions brought forth. I felt that we were all, in fact, thinking differently, but thinking about things together and in ways that were very mutually enriching. So I felt that the conversation was actually building something. It wasn't just talk, and that's really impressive. I thought we all, in some funny way, gathered around how do we understand energy, how do we understand the environment, how do we understand our materiality as part of and in the environment, how do we understand global warming, how do we make it real, how do we make these things visible, how do we communicate our understanding. Those were things that I thought united many of the papers. And in the end, how do we contribute to the great turning, and what kind of future do we want to create or want to imagine? And that's one of the things I found really incredibly impressive about this discussion, was that it and maybe it's because, unlike rather pedestrian social scientists, which I consider myself one, we have humanists here in the room, and they're not afraid to be poetic at times and evocative as well as provocative. So I was really, really impressed at the sort of level of discussion around ethics, values, spirituality, imagination, creativity, and so on. I think these are all resources that we have to bring to this discussion and to our attempts to move the world. And I think that we are really good people to do that. It's been left to scientists and engineers. They have really important things to do and say, but I think that in order to make things actually change and imagine where we really want to go, we need humanists, we need people like us. So I think that it is an enormously hopeful science program sort of getting born that has to impart that message. And I'd like to end with a brief mention about teaching. We've discussed a lot of people's courses. I have found the references that people gave to books and articles and films and online stuff really interesting, but I would also love to see more about the courses that people have taught. So I think that moving forward from this, it would be really nice to contribute to a sort of shared syllabus spot online. I think that would help us to be in dialogue with each other about one of the really profound ways that we do communicate to people, which is with our students. After all, we are mostly involved in that game of education in one way or another. And I wanted to just sort of say some of the things, some of the branches I would love to see explored more, or sort of, I don't know, branches. I don't know what metaphor you use. People talked about diversity and the need not to move ahead only in one direction. I think that's a place where we can take metaphors from the natural world and use them in the world of knowledge and community building. Another strand that was sort of below the surface, but I think worth talking more about, is the relationship of equality to quality of life, to quality of interaction between humans and the environment. The discussion of the commons that came up was, I thought, also really evocative and a strand of thinking to develop. And to sort of think about and embody as a group maybe new configurations of political activism, new imaginaries of action, of movement building, of imagining and doing things together. together. That I thought was also really helpful. So I would like to think that it might be interesting to put some of these essays together and get them online or do something like that to again affirm the richness of the discussion. Even if it's just a couple of paragraphs and references, something that you could do off the top of your head, I think that would be great. It'd make a really interesting resource. And I myself would like to see an email list with everybody's name. These are very like, you know, sort of prosaic things, but I would like to affirm that I think we've done something. Mostly you, because this is the first time I really said anything, but I think we've done something really amazing in this room over the last couple of days.
Okay, the green light's on, everyone can hear? Great. So I'm Richard Johnson. I am the director of the Administrative Center for Sustainability and Energy Management here at Rice, which is a long way of saying I'm the campus sustainability officer. I'm also the outgoing associate director of the Center for the Study of Environment and Society, and I want to thank Dominic for the very gracious tribute to CSES in the introduction. I'm also a professor of the practice of environmental studies and sociology, and so I co-teach with Elizabeth, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And for those of you who maybe this is your first time in Houston, you know, I worry that people get this impression that Houston, you know, that people in Houston say, you know, we have both kinds of energy, oil and natural gas. And, you know, there's this really, actually, this split personality in Houston. Yes, we are the Petro Metro, but I think as was discussed earlier, you know, Texas is also the leading producer of wind power in the United States, by far. And, you know, in Houston, the city of Houston government is the largest municipal purchaser of renewable energy in the United States. Houston has one of the largest assemblages of green buildings in the United States. And I think this sort of split personality is maybe can be embodied by the figure of George Mitchell, who was one of the earliest proponents of sustainable development and a very active philanthropist in the field. He was also the inventor of fracking. And, you know, and they coexisted together in this one person. I think that's sort of a metaphor for, you know, for the city. So, you know, I don't want you to think that we're all ancient sunlight here in Houston. You know, we rely on current solar income as well. So I'm first and foremost a practitioner, as I've said, as a sustainability officer, and I wrestle with issues of energy and climate change in my work every day. And so I was pleased to hear so many different stories about energy futures from the panelists over the last few days, because you saved me from the task of having to devote my time to responding to Chuck McConnell's story from the opening day that suggested that we have but one energy future ahead of us. But in fact, there are numerous potential energy futures, many of which are actually quite appealing and well worth fighting for. You know, for instance, Amory Levins in his book Reinventing Fire presents multiple scenarios that are firmly rooted in data that suggest we can achieve an economically strong future in the year 2050 powered almost exclusively by renewable energy using today's off-the-shelf technologies requiring, thankfully, no acts of Congress to implement, and that these scenarios collectively are trillions of dollars cheaper than the business-as-usual path. So these stories of other energy futures cross so many dimensions, you know, the availability of fossil fuels or not, impact on global warming or not, political, economic, technical feasibility, ethical choices, rights of current versus future generations, and so on. And as a practitioner, I have to make sense of all these stories and of all this ambiguity. And so when we were developing our energy master plan for the campus, the Rice Integrated Climate and Energy Master Plan, we felt that the inevitability of fossil fuel story had, frankly, too many question marks and too many risks associated with it to serve as our single guiding story. So in the face of this uncertainty, we felt that the responsible path of the university was to begin to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and to focus first on significantly reducing our overall energy consumption through energy efficiency. We've charted a 25-year path for becoming carbon neutral as a university. In fact, it looks like we're moving forward with our first major renewable energy project this summer. You know, guess what? Solar power actually now pays back, and is economically worth doing. And we're doing this because we believe it's time to adopt a strategy of change. I had a formative experience in graduate school where I got to travel to Curitiba, Brazil, which is a leading case study of a sort of a sustainable makeover of a city, or an eco-city, if you will. And of being able to spend time with Jaime Lerner, who was the mayor who led a lot of that process, and he went on to become the governor of the state of Paraná. And Lerner often spoke of tragedies, and here by tragedies I do mean it in the sense of human and environmental catastrophes. And he said if you can project the tragedy, you have the tragedy, right? And thus, unless you change, you are invested in enabling the tragedy to occur. And so the only way to counter a strategy of tragedy is to adopt a strategy of change. So in that spirit, I'd like to offer a few suggestions and thoughts for your burgeoning field of energy and environmental research in the human sciences. These are not research suggestions. I'm not a researcher, so I didn't feel like I could really go into that territory. But first, wrestle energy away from the engineers. Energy knows no departmental boundary, and in fact I was saying to my wife last night when she asked, well, what departments are all these people in? And I said, I don't know, that's the great thing. I don't know, and they're having wonderful conversations. So I can say this as a former engineer, don't let the engineers control the storytelling, because if you do, you're likely to be told that there's only one story, and they're the ones who run the numbers, and you saw that already, right? So you need to be equal members of the table. Second, create opportunities for students to act. Jaime Lerner would often say that people in city governments put off doing things because they want to understand and study everything, and that they don't understand that innovating is about starting. So he would say start, just start, act. Give your students opportunities to work on real problems. So I co-teach with Elizabeth, and we find that when you create an opportunity for students in the human sciences to work on project teams to create real solutions for campus environmental problems, they can accomplish great things. Never underestimate the ability of 3 or 4 or 5 students to create complete and total change on your campus or beyond. In my view, this is how we overcome the depressive paralysis and the environmental guilt. When you start, you feel engaged, you invest yourself in a solution. Now, solutions sounds like an engineer's word, and in fact, I also co-teach a class in chemical engineering called Engineering Solutions for Sustainable Communities. But the radical thing about that class, from my perspective, is that we require the engineers to read and to write. And seriously, for some of the students, it's literally the first time that they actually read about and think about and write about energy beyond the scale of optimizing processes and creating products. Right, and these are the future leaders of our energy companies. These are the folks who are going to make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on the Houston Ship Channel, right? So we attempt to equip our students to read and write critically about energy well before we let them start crunching any numbers. So third, lure the STEM majors into your classes, as Matthew has done so wonderfully here at Rice. Or otherwise embed yourself with a STEM faculty member and foster a holistic interest in literacy and energy. There are few topics more important in the world and few topics more poorly represented in the course catalog as energy. A fourth idea, and this just came up in response to the last session, and it's about having your ideas heard. And I borrowed this from my wife. My wife is in the digital humanities field, and she's published all kinds of peer-reviewed papers and reports. And some people have read them, but she has a blog, and she's had over 250,000 people view her entries on her blog, and that is how she gets her name and her ideas out. So if you want a quick way to communicate, blog. And finally, and very selfishly, I humbly advise that you reach out to your campus sustainability officer if you haven't already, and if you have one on your campus. We are kindred spirits, we're willing partners, and we'll go to great lengths to help you and your students succeed. especially when you turn your focus towards the campus itself. So thank you, and thanks to CENHS for this wonderful event, and I'd love to pass it on now.
Hello, I'm Kristen Winterstein. I'm just finishing up my first year on the faculty in the Department of History at the University of Houston. So I would like to think that I can help on this panel to represent the partnership between Rice and the University of Houston, so I'm new to the area, but I'm really looking forward to continuing that to build this collaboration. And I think that's, as far as prescriptions for the future and for Houston and beyond, one of the great ways that we can continue to work interdisciplinarily, and moreover the public-private partnership, because they're very different institutions, and so trying to think together I think could be really fruitful. And so I want to thank you for inviting me, and also I want to thank the previous panelists for their attention to teaching. So I also think a lot about teaching, despite the fact that I'm at a giant university. And I think I do agree that this is one of the ways that we can best make our voices heard as scholars. So of course digital media as well, but actually, communicating with students who are going to use these skills and these new thoughts to bring new ideas forth in the future. So, and of course, not only in engineering, but also in the humanities. And I heard a report on NPR this past week that was measuring, some study at Wharton was measuring the discrimination among faculty and students, and this report buried within there that in humanities, they found the least amount of discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities in terms of corresponding between faculty and students. So it's kind of a plug for the humanities that this particular article didn't make, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so for my comments, I've mostly been thinking about themes. I guess I didn't tell you what my field is, so I'm an environmental historian of Latin America, and I'm working on my first book right now, which is about the industrialization of the fishing industry in the Southeast Pacific Ocean, so specifically the fisheries of Peru and Chile. And these fisheries developed on an industrial scale after World War II, and the overwhelming majority of the fish that has been harvested from this area has been and continues to be directed towards fish meal, which is an ingredient in animal feed. So this is the most productive, biologically most productive marine ecosystem in the world, and the vast majority of these proteins are basically being extracted and ground up into a flour-like substance that is shipped around the world to animal farms. So this is for chicken and pork, and then more recently farmed fish. So it's speaking of questions of visibility and invisibility, that's something that I think about a lot. So the comments that I have are sort of in the context of environmental history as a field, and also more generally, what intersects with the presentations that have been made here. So the first one came up particularly in the last panel as well, the challenging nature of questions of scale. So when I think about scale, I think about both space and time. Geographers speak about a multi-scalar approach to their studies as a way of getting at the relationship between macro and micro. And so one theoretical concept that's used to, I guess, engage the multi-scalar would be this concept of translocality, also something that Dominic mentioned in the last panel, the notion of sort of linking processes that are happening on a local scale to show patterns that are going on more broadly, or conflicts and differences. So many of the papers in this conference speak indirectly to the unevenness of the energy landscape, so how industrialization has taken place in an uneven way across space and time, so both the environmental costs and, of course, the environmental benefits of these processes. Some historians have also written about a more recent biological term in historical scholarship, and how this enables a recognition of the role of ecosystems in shaping historical processes. So thinking about the environment as an agent, whether the environment has agency or not is a separate debate, but the role of processes that are defined in different ways from how we've been thinking of them before. So nature is not a static or fixed entity. So the second major theme that I was thinking about was the interconnectedness of land, water, and atmospheric ecosystems, or systems in general, and how this reality clashes with both previous epistemologies, so framed, for example, by national boundaries or local boundaries, and how this reality clashes with the capitalist market systems, such as, for example, the creation of property rights from systems that are not easily bounded by these artificial boundaries. So furthermore, human and natural environments are fluid and dynamic, so it's also something I'm thinking about a lot is movement. So obviously with fish, they move a lot, and so this is a unique situation, but also analogous to many others. They move across boundaries, and moreover, the ecosystem that I'm working on is characterized by seasonal changes and also sort of different processes going on at the local level, even though it's thought of as a large marine ecosystem. And so these local level differences can get kind of obscured if things get framed, for example, nationally or even transnationally. And then, of course, so this was somewhat less represented here, but it did come up indirectly, the importance of the oceans in land-based energy systems and trade systems. So oceans being in-between spaces where flows of people, wealth, and resources, and also waste pass across the globe. The oceans are still vast and mysterious, much more so than most land-based ecosystems. And the oceans are also a site where electricity or energy is generated. So there's thermodynamic electricity, offshore wind farms, oil rigs, etc. These are some of the ones that have come up. So the third theme I was thinking about is how interdisciplinary scholarship can help to solve contemporary environmental problems. So not just talking about it, but also working towards solutions. There's one very exciting example from my perspective that I wanted to mention. Some of you might be familiar with it. An environmental historian named Mark Carey, who's in Oregon. He is working with a team of, I guess they're geologists and maybe paleoclimatologists, but they've got NSF funding to study glaciers and climate change in the Peruvian Andes, which is one of the most important regions for studying this phenomenon of climate change and how it will impact water supplies. So, the glaciers there are melting, and it's the main source of water supply for this very arid region of the Andes, and also is a source of hydro energy. So this has important implications for both local subsistence as well as national level infrastructure projects or regional. And so, this research is ongoing, but it's really important for examining, for example, how science and scientific knowledge is contested and how the control over technologies are contested, because they were able to examine how local indigenous communities both contest and embrace the technologies that were used to build infrastructure for energy, for example, the hydroelectric dam, and also to protect them from risk, so namely the increasing occurrence of glacial outburst floods because of melting glaciers, which perhaps the avalanche that just occurred in the Himalayas has also to do with this process. So it's really with global implications. So what they found in the Andes is that, or in the Peruvian Andes where Mark Carey worked, he showed in his book, his 2010 book, and other forthcoming research, that these local communities at first were sort of excluded from the knowledge that was being generated by outside experts, such as glaciologists who come from Europe or North America to study this area, and then they would work with the state, but and perhaps incorporate local knowledge, but not really share the information of their reports with these communities. And their reports were talking about the deadly risks to their communities. So first there was this process of contestation in a way, but eventually once infrastructure projects were built, the local communities started to demand to have control of these and or participate centrally in the governance of these. So this is some of the background of clashes that have occurred more recently. For example, the Bolivian water wars is something that's really mostly discussed in the context of neoliberalism, but the roots of these sort of social and economic clashes go way farther back than that. Okay, so the fourth one, just to wrap up, is how new technologies help us to link past and present. and historicize contemporary environmental debates. So this is sort of a more obvious one. Digital humanities provide us with new technologies for visualization that can help us to recognize historical patterns that were otherwise too diffuse to notice, or would take multiple lifetimes of a single person's work to be able to comb through that much data. There's a new focus on the senses as an analytical methodology. So a lot of the presentations here dealt with sight, which is one area that does benefit a lot from new technologies, new digital technologies. And then there also is the question of sound and smell. So I work a lot with smell in particular. And these are relatively more elusive, at least for historians, to engage. So there are descriptions of sounds and smells, but it doesn't, especially smell is something that's, I don't know of any technology that can capture smell. So anyway, and thinking about how forms of resistance have changed over time and how technology relates to that changing nature of, for example, environmentalism is now sort of more decentered and localized, but also makes linkages to planetary scale consciousness. So that's basically what I have, but it's kind of a plug for not only the usefulness of history for contemporary policy issues, but how interdisciplinarity can sort of, I think, reaffirm actual disciplinary approaches, but not at the expense of others. But I think that that's what I think about interdisciplinary. I guess.
My button there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Derek Woods. I'm a PhD student here at Rice in the English department, working on environmental literature, ecological consciousness, and environmental aesthetics in the 20th century. And I'm also a predoctoral fellow in CENHS in Dominic's Excellence Center. And I operate its website, which is culturesofenergy.com. So do have a look. We've just done a post recently on actually a new issue of Diacritics, the illustrious literary criticism journal, which is edited by Karen Pinkus, our moderator. And it's a really great issue. The post just kind of gives you an introduction to it. So have a look at that. And so I just want to make, I guess, a couple comments going off of something that Matthew Schneider-Meyerson said yesterday about the Anthropocene. The notion of the Anthropocene, which on the one hand seems to elevate the human to the status of the master and who that has the ability to control the geological forces of the planet, but at the same time seems to disempower us when you go around and ask people to feel as though they have power to do anything about climate change or to individually wield any of those geophysical forces. So I think that kind of raises the question, what is the subject of the Anthropocene? What are the actual agents and sources of agency that are changing the structure of the planet, its geological composition, and its nutrient cycles? And in that sense, it seems to me that you can kind of go back into the history of ecology and think about what its theoretical kind of problematic has been since really Arthur Tansley's famous paper of 1935, The Uses and Abuses of Vegetational Concepts and Terms, which is where he proposes the ecosystem concept for the first time. It's kind of an interesting essay because really it's interesting to me as a literary scholar, because really it's a piece of rhetorical analysis where he's criticizing the work of his colleagues who are all basically organicist ecologists, where their notion of what an ecosystem is actually a sort of higher scale organism. So the analogy of the organism gets scaled up. And he says ecosystems aren't organisms because they're composed of a lot of dead stuff too. So we have to think about the way that non-organic, inorganic, and living matter are imbricated together. And later it becomes a cybernetic ecosystem concept, of course. But what I'm more interested in is this process of looking for alternatives to organic totalities, which seems to me to be important to defining what the subject of the Anthropocene would actually be. So in recent theory, there have been lots of different options along those lines. There's Bruno Latour's actor network theory in anthropology. Things like Manuel Delanda drawing on Toulouse-Guattari's assemblage theory. And so there are many different kinds of assemblage and network level structures that are used to name the kind of the linkages of human and non-human systems to replace. Well, and so then I guess we've had any number of those, and they can replace organic totalities, ecosystem network. But then to go back to the question of what the subject of the Anthropocene is, it seems to me that we actually need to continue that theoretical process of figuring out what sort of assemblages are really responsible for the geophysical changes that we're interested in right now. This is what I see as part of the future of the field. Because the way that we usually narrate the problem is to say that the humans are the cause. And of course they are in a sense, and you sound like a global warming denier if you don't think that humans are the cause, and certainly I do. But it's just that the question of what's actually inside the anthropos of the Anthropocene, what the anthropos part means, isn't very well addressed a lot of the time. So when we narrate it, the human species, Homo sapiens, changes the geophysical structure of the planet. When we narrate it like that, I think that we miss a lot of subtlety, which it could be derived from the history of technology and from really the difference that technology makes at different periods of human history. So we talk about technology a lot, of course, but not so much about how humans and technologies are networked together to become these terraforming agents, basically, that are transforming the geology of the planet. So that, I think, is a really important theoretical task for the environmental human sciences going forward.
Last but not least.
All right, thank you, everyone. So I'd like to echo everyone else in thanking Dominic and the leadership of the center for putting this on and for their mentorship and creating such a rich environment to think through these larger problems and also our individual projects. I'm a PhD candidate in the anthropology department here, and at the moment I'm a full-time dissertator. And so this has been really great for helping to think through a lot of the problems I'm working on. My project involves very large-scale marine spatialization, planning, and management in the Pacific. So I'd just like to echo the importance of the oceans, the term importance of the oceans, especially in the NGO sector, management and conservation. It's in full swing now, so it's something worth paying attention to. Yesterday and then today, especially, I think we've talked about problems of communication, and I think maybe in the energy humanities, more than maybe a lot of other parts of the human sciences, there's also this sort of impulse to do something, right? And then we had this great panel with Dominic and Imre about power, right? And so I wonder if communication and if power, why not rhetoric? And rhetoric in sort of the beginning with the classical sense of persuasion, right? The arts of persuasion, which to me seems to have, at least potentially, a unifying potential in the human sciences. It's sort of like, it's already been sort of used as a sort of language between different disciplines of the human sciences. And I'm thinking in particular, like recent books, George Kennedy has a book called Comparative Rhetoric, which grounds rhetoric both interculturally but and interspecies in the concept of energy, which has a resonance, I think, somewhat with psychoanalytic theory, but also with affect theory. And so I really enjoyed Matthew's talk yesterday on that. And then also there's a more recent book called Ambient Rhetoric by Thomas Rickard, which is trying to ground the very basis of rhetoric in our material existence, which might be worth looking into. And so, I mean, sort of like, being an ethnographer, we're very good at the micro scale. And so I sort of, instead of, waxing theoretical, wanted to sort of like just tell 3 little short stories that sort of illustrate what Dominic put better than I could, is the snapping into place and around this sort of figure of the hypo subject. And the first one, I think, and it's one we're all familiar with because Catherine Hale was just here. But if you've watched the first episode of Years of Living Dangerously, how many have seen it? Okay, just a few. I recommend watching it. I mean, she fascinates me. She's an incredibly wonderful person, but also she embodies a new metaphor, right? She's a Christian climate scientist, and if Christian climate scientist, then maybe Christian climate science, which makes me very uncomfortable. There's like tension between those 2 terms, and the convergence of those 2 terms. But also, if you watch the documentary, you see people respond to that, and you see all of these things that become entangled together, right? These sort of converging, divergent narratives, if we want to call it something like that, sort of untangle right before your very eyes. And people say, it never crossed my mind that I could be a Republican and know that climate change is a fact. Like, it just never crossed my mind. And I trust her because she's one of us, right? So I guess when I say rhetoric, partly I don't want to say that it's all just about the language and just it's a disembodied mind, saying words and then we're persuaded by it. It wouldn't work if any of us did it in that particular case. And so the second story actually comes from my fieldwork. In the Gilbert Islands, I spent a little bit of time there on a small atoll, and I was doing a biocultural diversity survey with Conservation International, the local government, and another agency. And we found out the local people were actually taking and eating what were probably green turtles, which are on the IUCN Red List. I actually forget if they're endangered or threatened, and they're not on the Red List because of the actions of these local people. They get caught in fishing nets, they're migratory species, and so forth. But from years of experience in the region with people like this, we knew that saying that these are red-listed species, they're globally endangered, you shouldn't eat them, that really doesn't get a lot of traction. And so really, what these practitioners negotiated with these people was that, okay, if you have to eat them, we know it's important to you, but at least let them nest first. Right, so you let the turtle nest and you let it return to the ocean. And the sort of metaphor that emerged from that was not endangered species and not turtle as food, but this metaphor of endangered food. Right, and you talk about these moments of just snapping into place. You had these 2 communities in practice that just blocked it, right? There was this sort of understanding between the 2 that wasn't there before. And just one other, actually, experience I had yesterday with the poster session, and I was fortunate enough to help Matthew with his Energy Humanities class this semester. And I was talking with one of the students who's going into corporate finance. And he said, yeah, you're an anthropologist. We had an anthropologist come and talk to us in this class. And she was talking about wind energy. He was talking about simony. And he said, you know what? Our classic economic models cannot explain what's going on. We need new ways of thinking about energy and resources. And I was like, you know what? You're excited now? Go into corporate finance. Don't go into the humanities. Like, we need people like you who understand this, right? Which sort of gets back to what has sort of been like maybe an underrepresented theme in the conference so far, although I'm glad we got back to it today, was communication, interaction with business, energy humanities or environmental humanities in the boardroom. What would that look like? Which, has, I'm sure, all sorts of problems, but also, the stakes seem pretty high, so why not think about it? So just sort of ending maybe with 3 questions related to energy and environmental rhetoric. What forms of persuasion work and for who? So like, who are our units? What is our unit of analysis and who are we targeting? Is it a community of experts or is it some sort of kind of public? How do material forms of energy become culturally meaningful? So, I mean, for a new object or event to become culturally meaningful, we have to persuade ourselves and others of some kind of meaning. At least I think so. What are the limits of persuasion and rhetoric? Like, what does it not help us understand? Yeah, and I think that's it. Thank you.